They succeeded because they had moral authority. One thing about nonviolent movements is, even though it is soft power, it is invisible. There is power in actually having moral authority or being viewed to be more upstanding or more upright, something that aligns with people's values. And people are going to turn away or look down on a regime that is going to be brutally repressing a peaceful protest. As in the view or in the perception of the international community, and even locally within that nation, even people who are loyal to the regime may have some niggling doubts about the virtue of slaughtering peaceful protesters or brutalizing them one way or another. The second thing is, a non-violent movement, unlike a violent movement, anybody can participate. You see, for a violent movement, I need a certain amount of physical strength and capacity to fight or to go hungry, to be a junta, to be a person fighting in the forest. But non-violent resistance uses two means. You can either be a concentration, like a mass protest, or a dispersion. We all stay home and nobody goes to work, or strikes and things like that, sit-ins, boycotts and things like that. So everybody can participate, and that's the power of a non-violent resistance. Secondly, because you're not destroying property and things, although a repressive regime can fight back, can set things on fire, and there can be some destruction of property and a loss of life, it is not at the scale of when there are two parties that are involved in a violent conflict. The destruction is much less. And that means that after this whole struggle is over, the amount of rebuilding that you need to do, and think of rebuilding not just in terms of restoring destroyed infrastructure and destroyed businesses and property. There is also a certain trauma that is embedded in the population, and a resentment and a desire for vengeance that continues with violent uprisings, and that tend to perpetuate a cycle of violence and birth more violence. So violence begets more violence. So another thing that makes for successful movements is defectors. Servants. So for example, in the Odpor movement, I was saying about Slobodan Milosevic, the police simply refused to fire at protesters. They were given commands to shoot protesters and on the spot. But they said they saw their children in the protest movement and they wouldn't shoot. And we've also seen that sometimes even in Kenya, where the police just decide to reason with protesters and cool down temperatures and diffuse the tension. So you can always bring people to defect from that agenda to your side, and that's powerful. So we see this as it happened in Iran in 1977 to 1979. Iran had been ruled by a monarchy for about 300 years. And so at the helm was a man called Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He had inherited the throne at the tender age of 20. I don't think he was even 21. He had been schooled in the West, in Switzerland and so on. And he was quite autocratic in his ways. Well, to tell the truth, he was very progressive. He built a lot of steel plants. In his time, Iran was the largest car manufacturer in the Middle East. He had done petrochemical industries. He had modernized agriculture. He insisted on mass population literacy. He was huge on women's rights and their abilities to vote and to organize. So he was progressive in some ways, but people also found him repressive. Anyone who opposed him disappeared. He had this SAVAK, the secret police, that conducted all these surveillance activities on people. And in his time, a lot of these Iranian intellectuals were assassinated. The royal family lived a lavish lifestyle in the midst of, serious poverty. And so all these things created some resentment. And one other thing that people hated about him was the fact that he was seen to be cozying up to the West and had kind of abandoned the Islamic values and traditions that were precious to the people of Iran. He was secular and he didn't really care much about clerics. And so all these things didn't endear him to the population at all. His cronies, the elites, always used to get land contracts, and all these lucrative opportunities were set up just for his cronies, and that created the seeds of a revolution. So it started with mass protests on the street. Again, people power. They were shot on the spot and there were killings. And what they do in Shia rites, they have these 40-day cycles of mourning, and those became anidas around which people aggregated and started to form a movement. Pretty soon the women joined in, the clerics joined in, civil servants joined in. There was a huge oil strike. Around 2 million people refused to go to work. Now the government ordered for them to be collected from their homes and taken to the workplace by force, but they couldn't make them work, so they had a go slow. And pretty soon the banks were not working. So that's the economic pillar of power that was shaken. Soon government offices are not working, refineries are not working, because there are ripple effects in the economy. That was one weakening of the power. The second thing they did was they involved the clerics and the religious groups. So at that time, Ayatollah Khomeini was already exiled out of the country, but he would still send letters and people would aggregate in mosques. And so that became a point of aggregation and a point of solidarity. People congregated around religion. That was the social pillar of power that was shaken. And economically, we've already discussed. Now, the last thing to defect was the military. So under all this pressure of mass protests, where they would totally repress them, imprison them, beat them, and so on, but they continued and insisted on a peaceful strategy, they ended up forcing this Reza Shah to flee to America. And in that time, he installed a certain man as a prime minister. And the military said they don't recognize him. And immediately there was a regime change. Ayatollah Khomeini came back. And soon the country, there was a regime change. And there was no, violent movement involved. The same thing with Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines.